everyone. Welcome. My name is Carissa Byrne-Hessek, and I am the director of the Prosecutors and Politics Project. The Prosecutors and Politics Project is a research initiative at the University of North Carolina School of Law. The Prosecutors and Politics Project has three major goals. First, to bring scholarly attention to the democratic accountability of elected prosecutors. Second, to increase our understanding of the relationship between prosecutors and politics through careful empirical study and analysis. And third, we have a goal to publicly share research and collaborate with other organizations to increase voters' knowledge about their elected prosecutors and broader criminal justice issues. Today, we're going to be sharing results of our latest empirical study, which is a pilot study of the media coverage that prosecutors receive. The project collaborated with Ryan Thornburg, who's a professor at the University of North Carolina's Hussman Journalism School on the study, and seed funding for this study was provided by UNC's Vice Chancellor's of Research Office. Now, I can say we were very interested in conducting this study because we wanted to know a lot more about what voters can find out about their local prosecutors by reading media reports. I think this is an important topic because local prosecutors are in most states an elected office. They have a lot of power, and so voters need to have a sense of how that power is being wielded in order for them to make informed decisions at the ballot box. I should say, I don't have a lot of confidence, and I didn't have a lot of confidence walking into this study that voters have that information because there's some evidence that many Americans don't even realize that their prosecutor is elected. So if you don't know the prosecutor's elected, you probably don't have a good sense of what's going on in their office. Now, because we had only limited funding, we couldn't do a national study, which is ordinarily what we do. That's what we've done in the past. But the pilot study that we did, I think, still gives us a lot of information about media coverage of prosecutors. So let me say a little bit about what we looked at in our pilot study. We selected a certain number of jurisdictions. We wanted to focus on an election year. And so we chose some states that had elections during the 2020 year. We started our data collection in 2021. So we wanted to look at the most recent election year, which at the time was 2020. Aside from whether they had an election in 2020, we looked at some other criteria to select our states. One of the criteria that we looked at was whether we were going to have access to media reports in that state. And in order to determine that, we used a really valuable resource that's been compiled by UNC's Journalism School of all existing news sources in states. And then we checked that list against the availability of sources within our databases that we used to make sure that we had a very high percentage of those media sources in our data set. Then, in addition to that, once we found states that had good coverage, we wanted to have some regional variety. So we ended up selecting a state in the Northeast, a state in the Midwest, a state in the Southwest, and a state in the Pacific Northwest. So the states we ended up selecting, just in case these outlines don't look familiar to you, are Arizona, Kansas, New York, and Oregon. And then within those states, we also had to select jurisdictions because many of them have a lot of counties, each of which elects their own prosecutor. And so in selecting counties within the states, we looked to get a good mix of different population levels. Some of the counties had very large populations, some of them had much smaller populations. And then we also tried to make sure to get a good mix of contested elections and uncontested elections. So once we'd selected our jurisdictions, then it was time to conduct the study. And I just want to give you guys like a brief overview of our methodology, what we ended up doing so you can have a sense of where this data comes from. So the first thing we had to do is we had to figure out who ran in the elections. whether an incumbent was running for re-election, whether that incumbent was facing a challenger. If the incumbent decided not to run and we had an open seat election, was that a contested or uncontested? How many people ran in 2020 for this office? Once we had the names of all of our incumbents and our candidates, we did searches for those names in 2 different databases. The first is Newsbank's America's News, and the second is the LexisNexis News database. These sources contain a few TV transcripts and a few online sources, but the vast majority of what we were looking at was print media, so newspapers. Once we'd found all of the results that mentioned these people, we sorted through to make sure they were actually talking about the prosecutor and someone who's running for office and not someone who coincidentally had the same name. And then we also went through and identified duplicates and removed those stories. So we had a clear sense of the quantity of information that we needed to see. And then for the study itself, we did something called a content analysis, which is just a fancy way of saying we read things and we categorized them and we assigned codes to different things that we found so that we could quantify them, so we could count them and sort of say 35%, blah, 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 blah. Now, what does that mean to sort of go through and to classify them? So let's say, for example, we wanted to have a sense of how much the article was really about the prosecutor and how much the article was just sort of mentioning the prosecutor in passing. We would read the articles, we would have ourselves and our research assistants read these articles and note whether the prosecutor was mentioned only once in the article or whether the prosecutor was mentioned more often than that. And then there would be a little code associated with that. It's what we call coding. Now, sometimes that coding is incredibly straightforward. Was the prosecutor or the candidate mentioned only once is just an easy question to answer. But sometimes it required the exercise of judgment, like when we were coding whether an article had a positive tone, a negative tone, or a neutral tone. And so what we did there was we trained our coders and performed an inner coder reliability check, which again is just a fancy way of saying we had everybody go through and do their categorizations for the same articles, and then we compared the extent to which they were the same and the extent to which they were different. We got really close, above 80% in terms of everybody being the same. And then we had some further discussions, we adjusted our instrument, and then we trained everyone on the same materials so that we could be consistent across the articles that we were coding. Okay, so that's how we performed all of this. Now let me tell you about our findings. And I'd say I like to think about our findings as falling into 3 categories. We have some findings about the quantity of media coverage, some findings about the content of the media coverage, and then some findings about the tone of that coverage. So let's begin with quantity. There were really significant differences in the amount of media coverage that different prosecutors and candidates received. The prosecutor with the most coverage was mentioned in more than 300 articles. And one incumbent prosecutor was mentioned in 0 articles, which is pretty remarkable. Our study spanned the entire calendar year of 2020. This local prosecutor was not mentioned at all in print media during that year. Overall, I'd say that the quantity of coverage was quite low. Because our study covered a full year, when we saw prosecutors who were mentioned only 6 or 7 times total, that signaled to us that voters probably didn't really hear the name of their prosecutor very often, at least from newspapers. Obviously, they might get information from elsewhere. In terms of, but to be clear, there was a lot of variation, and we found 3 factors that seemed to be associated with the amount of media coverage that someone received. The first factor was the type of candidate. Incumbents received a lot more coverage than people who were running to take the office for the first time. And in fact, if you just compare all incumbents, that probably understates how big the difference is in coverage between all incumbents and all non-incumbents, because with few exceptions, those non-incumbents are usually running in a contested election. And if you compare the amount of coverage that a contested incumbent receives as opposed to challengers, you can see that there is, so that the median, the average contested incumbent receives almost 8 times more coverage than the average challenger. So that's significantly more coverage. It's also possible that that an incumbent being in the race, or we also found that when an incumbent was in the race, candidates received less coverage. So if there was no incumbent running and we just had, multiple people running for an open seat, we found that there was more coverage in those elections for the individual sort of people competing for it than when they ran as challengers against the incumbent. Okay. So I kept talking about contested elections versus uncontested elections there when talking about incumbents and other candidates, because we found whether an election was contested was highly correlated with the amount of coverage that we saw. So contested elections, the folks who run in contested elections receive a lot more media coverage than folks who run unopposed. And this was true across all population categories. Now, we can't say whether contested elections are drawing that media coverage or if we're getting in a contested election because the Office of Prosecutor is getting more attention and raising awareness of the office, because we didn't do a causal study, but the correlation is quite clear. We also separated this out into population categories. We wanted to untangle the idea of population categories from contested elections, because our previous work on elections shows that how big your jurisdiction is, how many people are in it, is one of the major drivers of whether your election is contested. And for that, we actually have done sort of a sophisticated statistical analysis. Population is one of the biggest drivers of contested elections. The smaller the population, the less likely it is that a prosecutor election will have more than one candidate on the ballot. Now, this chart is a little bit strange because our biggest jurisdictions are jurisdictions that had more than 1 million people. We actually didn't have any uncontested elections there, and we do see a slight deviation there, sort of towards the lower categories. So there's not a perfect fit between coverage and population, but it still seems like there is a relationship there. Okay, so that's quantity of coverage. What about what the media coverage actually looks like? What about its content? And in some ways, I'll say the story about content of media coverage is sort of a story about what we didn't find. And we didn't find a lot of we didn't find evidence, a lot of things that we were looking for, because so much of the coverage ended up being relatively cursory coverage of the prosecutor. And so because of that, the big takeaway is really the idea that a lot of the coverage that prosecutors receive isn't necessarily providing the sort of information that we might think voters would want or need. Even more in-depth coverage, so not just coverage that mentioned a prosecutor in passing, but even more in-depth coverage often didn't include important information. So for example, more than 3/4 of the articles that we found didn't mention the fact that there was an election that year at all. It didn't mention an election. And in fact, one incumbent went all year without having any media coverage indicating that he was up for election that year. This is something that those of you who are familiar with that ACLU poll saying people don't know that their prosecutor is elected, this might be an important sort of data point to understand that study or that survey. I will say, even in those articles that mentioned incumbents and mentioned the election, they often didn't mention sort of prosecutorial decision-making or office policies. Again, the sort of thing that we might think voters would want to know about. And nearly half of all articles about non-incumbent candidates didn't mention their professional backgrounds or their platforms. And in our data set, we found 2 candidates who didn't receive any media coverage about their platforms at all the entire year. So as I said, a lot of this sort of missing information seems to be attributable to the fact that so much coverage was really sort of incumbents being mentioned in the context of an article that was about a particular crime. So there's a murder that happens, and there'll be like a mention that, so-and-so's the prosecutor has, obtained an indictment for felony murder, right? Or a quote from the prosecutor saying, our office has indicted this person for felony murder or something like that. Only 11% of the articles that we read were primarily about the election. So, and then even coverage that mentioned the election didn't necessarily sort of have all of the substantive information that one might want. And I should also add, in addition to this narrative about what information wasn't present, it's also probably important to pay attention to what information was being supplied in these stories and whether that information could potentially mislead voters. So our study found that a quarter of all articles mentioning an incumbent prosecutor were in the context of discussing a homicide. And rapes, shootings, other violent crimes were often mentioned as well. And all told, 40% of articles mentioning an incumbent prosecutor were articles about violent crime. And in contrast, drug crimes, theft, and other property crimes were only mentioned in 15% of articles. Now, that finding, by the way, is consistent with lots of other findings about media coverage of crime that points out that violent crime generally, and murders and homicides in particular, receive disproportionate coverage as compared to how often they happen. So in the year 2020, for example, there were more than 300 times more thefts in the United States than there were homicides. And yet the theft coverage was minuscule as compared to, the coverage about homicides. Now, I should add, I'm sure there's good reason for this, right? I think homicides are probably a lot more newsworthy than thefts. But one reason that researchers have often highlighted this is they've theorized that this may lead voters to think that violent crime is on the rise, even in years that it's not, and that they might actually perceive sort of public safety to be in greater danger than it is because of things like the availability heuristic and sort of the way people's minds think. Okay. So that's the content of coverage. And then I also wanted to talk about the tone of coverage that we found. This was something that I was pretty surprised by. I think when I read coverage about news coverage about prosecutors, I often read coverage that seems to be taking a pretty skeptical or somewhat negative tone about those prosecutors. And that's not what our study found at all. We found overall that most media coverage, more than 3/4 of stories, was neutral in tone. There was some positive coverage. 13% of articles were positive in their coverage, and negative coverage was the least common. Only about 5% of articles had negative coverage. Non-incumbents had slightly higher levels of both positive and negative tone than incumbents. Again, probably attributable to the sort of cursory mentions of incumbents that we saw. So I was curious, like, why would it be that I was under such a misimpression about how much negative coverage happened? And I think the reason might be that negative coverage seemed to be correlated with both large populations and with contested elections. And those are probably the articles that I tend to read more of. And so negative tone was probably overrepresented in what I read as compared to media coverage more generally. So in the largest jurisdictions, so jurisdictions with more than 1 million people, we saw negative coverage in almost 10% of articles, so almost twice as often. And then we also saw negative coverage far more often in contested elections than in uncontested elections. There was only one uncontested election where we had a candidate receive more than the sort of the median, more than 5% of negative coverage. Okay. That's sort of it for our findings. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen if I can figure out how to do that. Always a challenge. Maybe I hit escape. No, maybe I hit enter. Maybe I pause the share. Maybe I stop the share. There we go. You'd think after 2 years of teaching remotely with Zoom that law professors everywhere would know how to operate the platform, and yes. I'm obviously happy to take questions about our report. There's a lot more we've written a report about this study. It's available online. We'll get the link up in the chat for anyone who'd like to read more about the findings or see some more specifics. But rather than just talking about the study, I'm really excited that we're joined today by a group of very impressive panelists to talk about media coverage and local prosecutors. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce all of them and then have a back and forth with each of them so that we can get deeper into this topic. So we're joined today by Mark Dupree, who's the elected district attorney in Wyandotte County, Kansas. Julie Gunnigal, who's the legal director for Arizona NORML and who was a candidate for prosecutor in Maricopa County, Arizona in both 2020 and 2022. George Joseph, who's a senior reporter for the city. Will Knight, who's an attorney in Arizona and who's also a candidate for prosecutor in Maricopa County, Arizona in 2020. And Ryan Thornburg, who's an associate professor here at the University of North Carolina, go Tar Heels. He is at Hussman School of Journalism and Media. So just to be clear, we're going to have a panel Q&A, but we're also leaving some time for audience members to ask questions as well. If you have a question, you should feel free to post that using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to those, I promise, before this event is over. So I'm going to go ahead and start with our media experts, and Mr. Joseph, I'd like to start with you. I'd like to ask you about a complaint that I often see from people in the criminal justice reform community. They complain that reporters, I think as they put it, serve as stenographers for law enforcement, just repeating what they say rather than sort of subjecting it to scrutiny. Now, I'll say I don't think that anyone's accused you of that, nor could they if they've read your work, which is incredibly substantive. But what context do you try to provide in addition to statements that you receive from prosecutors and other law enforcement officials in order to inform your readers?
Thank you. That's a great question. First of all, I would say that we need to look at the political economy of the media rather than focusing on individual reporters' personalities. And that economy has shrunk, over the decades to the point where most newsrooms are just sort of barely getting by, putting out what they can at a very rapid clip and don't have much time for in-depth reporting. I'm lucky I work at a publication called The City here in New York City, where we're a nonprofit news outlet. I'm on an investigations team. I get weeks, even months to work on stories. But your average reporter in a mid-sized city is sort of being asked, what can you put out today? A crime story that's all packaged to go with the indictment there available, the facts as alleged are there, a DA statement is there. You can even go to the courtroom and ask people for comment, get some color. It's easy to put together in one day. And then these local reporters may go and ask the public defender's office for their perspective on a case. And what do they say? We cannot talk about a pending case. And then people complain, why don't you have both sides of the story here? Well, it was based on the indictment. The public defender wasn't willing to say anything. And a lot of public defenders' offices, even later down the line, let's say there's some suppression hearing that goes their way, or some sort of like affidavit that they, file or something. They're not proactively sharing that with the local newspaper to try to get their narrative out there. They're sort of just standing by, and letting things happen. So I think the sort of work pressures and sort of economy of reporting plays a major role in this. And people need to sort of be proactive, creative, and helpful if they want to change it.
That's an excellent answer. Thank you. I think that's that piece of it, I think, is really missing from the discussion. Now, one of our findings was that prosecutors in larger jurisdictions tend to receive a higher proportion of negative coverage than prosecutors in smaller jurisdictions. Do you have some thoughts about why that might be? Is it connected to something that you were just talking about, perhaps?
Yeah, I think the larger jurisdictions have better resourced newsrooms with more seasoned editors and more ambitious forms of work. And so, one, they have more time and just more sophistication and understanding the law and public policy. And also, they're sort of able to cultivate more sources and sort of get a more balanced picture. Whereas maybe a small town paper with just one person running the whole thing is sort of reliant on the DA to sort of keep feeding them things, and so sort of day-to-day mill of running stories. It's not to say that that excuses stenography, but they may fall into like a relation of dependence wherein they sort of rely on that, and then without any countervailing force providing something alternative, it's easy for that to happen.
That's fantastic. Okay, thank you. I wanted to ask you about another one of our findings. Our finding that that so much of the coverage in an election year didn't mention the fact that there was an election. Now, I imagine that it could probably seem out of place to mention "and so is up for an election" every single time that you're writing a story that mentions a prosecutor. I guess I was wondering if you could give us a sense of when you, as a reporter, might think it's appropriate to include the fact that a sitting prosecutor is up for re-election in a story that isn't otherwise about the election.
Yeah, that's a great question. You mentioned felony murder, so I think that's like an interesting example because different prosecutorial candidates, especially people who are running as what they would call reform prosecutors, sometimes have a different policy perspective, let's say on bringing felony murder charges or not, depending on the state. If there is a day-to-day sort of story about a case in which a felony murder charge was brought, while it wouldn't be at the very top of the story, maybe sort of later on in the context graphs, our reporter could bring up the notion of, this is actually an issue that is being debated right now in this race that's happening, and the election date is XYZ. So and so, says they would not bring such charges because it wraps in, numerous people who haven't actually pulled the trigger, that kind of thing. And whereas the incumbent has, filed, 600 felony murder charges over 20 years, whatever. That could be like very easy context to put in, but a reporter may not even be aware of that difference, especially if whoever the candidate is hasn't sort of reached out to the newspaper and made clear, here's what the differences are in policy, and here's sort of where you could inject, what's different about our policies in your day-to-day coverage.
So that answer, I think, sort of leads me to wonder. I was going to ask this in terms of challenges that you face to write the sort of in-depth, very informative articles that you do. But I think that answer just sort of hinted at maybe the more positive way to frame the question is what allows you to do that sort of in-depth reporting, and are there things that other folks, can do to help? And maybe there are challenges that are just sort of insurmountable, and money and time are the only thing, and maybe even money and time aren't enough to get past them. But since this is something that you could do, maybe you could enlighten us a little bit more on that.
Well, yeah, certainly having well-resourced newsrooms, not having news deserts in many of the places that your study looked at would further the potential for in-depth reporting. But also, there's so many different advocacy organizations now and progressive prosecutorial campaigns, that kind of thing, that are running, but they're not necessarily putting out a lot of material or sort of very packaged story ideas or pitches to reporters. And we've seen sort of some progressive DAs who have won then suffer, tremendous media backlash because of sort of fear mongering kind of messages from traditional outlets. But also, like, I've been a little bit surprised given that we've had a few years of this and these new district attorneys are coming in and not having like a very clear game plan to get out what they're doing and what's different, and sort of being reactive rather than proactive. So not everything is in their control, but putting their best foot forward in terms of media strategy and putting out story pitches and that kind of thing is certainly in their control.
Oh, that's great. You can see me taking notes. I'm like, oh, this is fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. George. I'm sorry, Mr. Joseph. Professor Thornburg, if we could turn to you. As you know, because you were instrumental in the study, our study found a pretty clear correlation between the amounts of coverage that prosecutors and prosecutor candidates receive and population, right? The larger the population, the more coverage. Can you talk a bit about the media landscape, the concept of news deserts that Mr. Joseph just mentioned, and sort of nationally how this picture looks?
Yeah, I think, echoing exactly what he just said about the economics of journalism today is really, really important. It's important for folks to understand how most news organizations make their money. Now, traditionally, newspapers and still television, most of the money is coming from advertising, right? And the way you make money from advertising is acquiring attention and then trading that for commercial benefit. And more news organizations, especially the national news organizations and in news organizations in larger cities, are switching to where maybe they've got 100% of their revenue coming from donors or subscribers or other forms of reader revenue, or models like the New York Times and other places that are sort of a 50-50 split, and then diversifying their revenue. And so these revenue models, depending on the area that you're in, really, certain larger population can lend itself to a different revenue model. It can scale differently. And it allows those news organizations as well to have more resources to give reporters time to ask questions and to follow up and to provide context. And I think that kind of context is something that can be really difficult for a reporter to drum up. Reporters are like minor league ball players in a lot of cases. They're moving from market to market and trying to get to the big leagues. And so, if they may stay a little while in one community, but they move on and they don't have the long-term context to know, what happened 5-10 years ago. And I think that's a real, that's a value that's hard to provide in a lot of places where reporters, may want to move on to something that's a more lucrative job.
Fascinating. So it's a question of sort of resources for the publications themselves, but also sort of like job market issues for the reporters. I wanted to ask you, Professor Thornburg, about our finding, which is consistent with lots of other studies, about the amount of coverage that was devoted to homicides and to other violent crimes. As I mentioned, there's a theory out there that this disproportionate coverage misinforms voters. It might sort of skew policies that get adopted because the public is afraid about crime. But at the same time, I can certainly understand that covering yet another break-in of a car where a car radio was stolen might not seem particularly newsworthy. What can media as sort of an institution in the United States do to try to balance these competing concerns?
I think this is a really hard challenge for journalism, because we talk about news being when the world doesn't behave as we expect. We don't write a story that says, today the sun came up in the east, right? Like, that is a very important thing that happens every day, but it's not news, right? And so we're drawn as audiences, and therefore as journalists, to things that are unusual. And so we tend to look for crime that doesn't happen as frequently. We're also drawn to things of larger magnitude, right? It's easy to understand that the cost of a human life is more important, has more emotional appeal, and has a bigger impact in the community and the people that were involved in that story than a theft. I think the real challenge for journalists is, how do you help people put those things into context? And so it's probably not by downplaying the murders, but it's by playing up the larger systems that we're seeing and the larger trends across crime, and beginning to ask important follow-up questions, not just, what is happening and who, what, when, and where, but why and how these things are happening, and try to understand those larger trends and put them into a little bit of context.
So I love that answer. And as someone who now is no longer in a newsroom, but instead training the next generation of journalists, how do you teach your students to do that? I mean, especially if they're going to take the sort of path that you mentioned and maybe spend, 18 months in one newsroom and then move across the country to another, sort of small town or mid-sized city for yet another job. What do you tell them in terms of providing that context and looking at systems? How can they learn to do that in a way to be effective, to do exactly what you're saying?
We can talk about it in the classroom, but then when you hit the real world of what the economics are, our youngest reporters in just about any city are working on breaking news desks, and where they spend a 6-hour chunk of time that is just filling a website. And it's not different than a lot of the pressures that national television news has had for 20 years. It's just that we're seeing it now in local organizations. And so we get a lot of our young people that are interested in doing this kind of work. They have to churn out stories. They have to capture people's attention, sort of 24/7. We know that when we ask people why they turn to the web, we can see the stories that they read, right? And so we can see now, we don't have the luxury of saying, well, this is what people want to know and this is what people need to know. And we can, we have so much evidence that shows that people tend towards crime, sports, and weather stories. And you go to any market, any news organization, and that's going to be true, whether we want it to be or not. And so there's a pressure to do those kinds of things. And so you have to, what I try to talk to my students about is looking for organizations that support that kind of reporting, and look for mentors and editors that will guide that kind of reporting, and to look at the business model and business structures of places that they go to work. It's not just enough to get a job, but it's to get a job in a place that makes their community better by providing context. And how do you learn to do that? You learn to do that by thinking about who's not in your story. It is easy as young people are starting out to take whatever information is instantly and readily available for them. That's why you see all sorts of reporters favor institutions. I know who to call at the police department. I know who to call at the DA's office. I know who to call at the school board. And it's a real challenge to think about. For every story you're doing, you're making a choice of a voice or a story or an agenda that is not being set, or a voice that's not being heard. And to surround yourself with diversity that can challenge you to what you're not hearing is really, really important.
That's wonderful. Thank you. So I have some questions for both Julie Gunnigal and Will Knight, because they are questions for folks who've run for prosecutor, and you guys were both in the county attorney race in 2020 in Maricopa County. And for those folks who aren't familiar with Arizona, Maricopa County is the most populous county. It's where Phoenix is located in Arizona. We're very, very lucky to have you both. You guys were candidates in the Democratic primary, and then Ms. Gunnigal ended up running in the general election as well. And then I know you ran in 2022 as well, because there was yet another election then. I wanted to compare the coverage that you both received to the coverage that the incumbent Alistair Edel, and I hope I'm pronouncing her first name right, Alistair Edel. We found that she received far more coverage than you do, and she actually received more positive and more neutral coverage. She also received far more in-depth coverage than either of you did. Very little of her coverage was the sort of in-passing coverage that we found as compared to both of you. It's one thing for me to tell you, like, we counted everything and this is what we found. Does that match up with your perceptions of the media coverage during the election?
Will, you want to go first?
You can take it away, Julie.
I feel so validated in this moment. Now, that was exactly what the experience as a candidate was like. And And I'll put it to you like this. It's no secret that I'm a huge Aaron Sorkin fan. There's this quote that I love where a congressman is saying, you know, everybody cares about XYZ social issue when it's on a public opinion poll, but on election day, nobody gives a damn. And the lobbyist turns around and says, no, you know, on election day, people give a damn about what I tell them to give a damn about. That's why I have a job. And it really feels like there's so many parallels with the media, because if the coverage is only passing when it comes to changes that need to be made in this office, what reason are the press giving to the public why they should care who's in there? And with respect to the power of incumbency, I think that's extra true, because in both the 2020 and the 2022 election, the incumbent was able to do this miraculous thing where she would call a press conference and announce a bold new office policy that was breathlessly reported in the news without any contemplation about whether or not that policy was actually a good one. Without that context, without that follow-up of what evidence do you have that this will actually make the public more safe. And if there is one perennial frustration running as a non-incumbent, it's that failure to ask that question. Where is your evidence?
Mr. Knight?
I completely agree with that. And if you call me Mr. Knight, I get to call you Professor Hessek. So yeah. And I want to point out that Alistair Adele was an unelected incumbent at that. So her predecessor had been appointed to the Supreme Court of Arizona after the midpoint between his last election and that one, which meant that the Board of Supervisors of the county got to appoint Alistair Adele, and yet she still enjoyed all of those powers of incumbency in the media that Julie was just talking about. And it's so important. I think it really could have really changed things, because now with hindsight, we can look back, and I'm not trying to speak ill of Miss Adele. I don't know if everybody knows, but she passed away not too long ago. But she resigned from that position due to a lot of problems in her office under her management and the policies that she was employing. And if those things had been brought to bear in a more comprehensive and comprehensible way to the electorate sooner, Julie Gunnivan would still be sitting in that chair. So I think it's a huge problem. I do think, while positive versus negative is subjective, I think the in-depth coverage really would benefit from hitting all of the candidates when there's a contested election, incumbency or not. And I'll point to one small example of it. The ACLU was the first organization that asked all of us that were involved in the primary election on the Democratic side about the death penalty. And while I believe Ms. Gunnivan and I are on the same page, I'm a staunch abolitionist. I dreaded that question coming up, because I spoke about it with Chesa Boudin, who at the time was the DA in San Francisco, and he put the fear of God into me because of how politically fraught that is, and very strongly recommended that I kind of talk around it. But the day I answered that question, a dear friend of mine who spent his entire life and career fighting for abolition and fighting the death penalty passed away. His name was Larry Hammond. And so I couldn't do anything except speak the truth on it. You would think that in Arizona, that would have been a really important thing to point out, because at the time I was the only candidate that was saying that so vocally. But no, there really was no coverage about that at all. On the other hand, somebody tweets a picture of me holding a gun legally and safely at a friend's house back when I was studying criminal law in your classroom way before this, and that's front page news in the biggest periodical in the Valley.
Yeah, that's Mr. Knight sharing to everyone that he was one of my earliest students back when I taught at Arizona State. I try not to say those things, Mr. Knight, because I try desperately to look younger than I actually am. I think, you know, I wanted to follow up on a point that you just made, Mr. Knight, which is also what I called you when you were in my classroom, which is the idea of how much voters knew about what Alistair Adele was doing after she'd been appointed to the office while she was the incumbent. Because our study found that there was, although she got a lot of coverage, right, she was mentioned very often in the newspapers, there was very little coverage about her office policies. And it's one thing for me as an academic to speculate that that meant voters in Maricopa County didn't know what her policies were, but you were both actually out there campaigning and talking to voters. Did voters know things even when they weren't reported in the media about what was happening in those offices? Or in
No,
that office, rather?
not even a little bit. And Julie, if I may, I'm going to give you a layup, just briefly. Absolutely not. Nobody knew. And I was staggered. So not staggered that I lost the primary. Julie ran an amazing campaign. She deserved to win. But I was staggered after I lost the primary when I started hearing things I said come out of Alistair Adell's mouth as if she was adopting platforms that I was running on. But substantively, absolutely not. She wasn't actually mechanically implementing them in any way, and she never did ultimately. So no actual in-depth dive into the actual policies and policy implementations, very surface level discussion on reforming things kind of, and how to do it by fewer prison sentences and holding police accountable and things like that without any concrete plans. Julie, I don't know if you want to expand on that, but that was
I sure do. I mean, all of that. And I think it's really important that it was some of the pressure that was applied during the primary, because do you remember the Maricopa County Attorney's Office, the third largest DA's office in the country, did not have a forward-facing policy manual until, we collectively started banging on that office and requesting it. And of course, there's always a difference between having the policy in black and white and how it's being implemented, and the black box of prosecution and how little information is actually publicly available really skews, I think, the coverage on it. But more importantly, during a contested and very close election, the office had a policy of politically prosecuting its opponents. It was during that time where almost 40 folks were rounded up during the summer uprisings and were charged as gang members, one of whom was facing 100.5 years. And how little coverage that received, not just in the moment of charging, where the media should have been skeptical that a group of protesters were as dangerous as the Bloods, Crips, and Hells Angels, but even in its aftermath, our paper of record has published, what is it, Will, one story on it. And it's only because of one brave reporter at a television station that we even know the scope and extent of that particular policy about political prosecutions.
Thank you. I have just a couple of more questions for our Arizona candidates before I turn to Mr. Dupree. Mr. Knight, I was hoping you could give us a little bit of insight about what it was like to run in a primary election, and in particular, it was a field there. It wasn't just you and Ms. Gunnigal. There were other candidates as well. Was it difficult to get your platform out there? Was it difficult to get the substance of what you were saying? I think you alluded earlier to this. I suspect that the answer is yes. But if you could talk a little bit about difficulties that you faced and maybe how you tried to address them.
Yeah, thank you for that. And it was an absolute nightmare. I mean, we have a problem with Maricopa County is so big, both geographically and as far as population size goes. Running for county attorney there is sort of like running for governor of Montana. Like, I mean, you're running for a huge jurisdiction, and there are so many different smaller communities. It's very different from most East Coast county size and population sizes. One really important thing that I knew was going to come out, and I'm going to say it's really clearly and loudly so that nobody misunderstands it, and you can hear me all the way at the back. I got a DUI when I was 18 years old. I knew that was going to come up, but to me, that was an asset. I mean, very genuinely, that's one of the reasons I went to college and became a lawyer in the first place, and specifically got into criminal law work, because I knew I had to turn my life around or I was going to end up like my dad because of that. So I was a justice system success story, and I wrote an op-ed about that so that I could be transparent and upfront about it to draw any sting that there could be. But really, I do believe that it's an asset. So I wrote an op-ed about that, and I could not find a place for it. The largest periodical in the Valley is the Arizona Republic. It's called Arizona Central Online. We tried to get it placed there, and they told us that they had a policy. I suspect, and Julie, you can confirm if this is actually true, but I suspect they invented that policy for our race. They had a policy where they would allow every candidate one and only one op-ed during the election cycle. And I didn't want to burn it on that. I very much was planning on winning the primary, and I wanted to burn it at that point. So foolishly, I never got to write mine. Julie wrote one before I even threw my name in the hat. But they wouldn't even look at it. I got it published in the Ahwatukee Foothills. And then later on, the Arizona Central, Arizona Republic did do a big story about it, a really lengthy piece that was a total nothing burger. I mean, if you read the thing, it's like, and then we asked Mr. Knight's government employers if he disclosed that to them, and he did. It just, there was no news there, but nonetheless, it made a huge story for them to just confirm everything and publicize it to everyone in the Valley that I got a DUI when I was 18 years old.
Ms. Gunnicle, I wanted to ask you a slightly different question, because you ran in both the primary election and then you ran in the general election. And I was curious whether you perceived any difference in either the coverage that you received or the ability to get coverage once the primary election was behind you and it was you facing off against the incumbent for the general election.
Yes, you know, I perceived, and I think Will is dead on this, that the media had very little interest in covering the primary. I think in part because it started out with such a crowded field. There were 5 of us, but even narrowing down to the 3 of us who made the ballot, any questions that we got were cursory. There were no deep dives. And frankly, I was not impressed even as we went to the general, the 2 deep dive articles that I can think of weren't that comprehensive, really didn't cover the issues that we were bringing up, kind of covered the race as it was about 2 different personalities instead of 2 vastly different policy positions. And that's, I think, the part that really does nobody any favors and doesn't serve the public when you can only talk about personality. It continued, for what it's worth, into the 2020 cycle. You know, we had several debates this time, which was different from the 2020 cycle. And after one debate, especially when I came in hot against one of these gun policies about ramping up sentences that's not rooted in evidence, not rooted in science, and I was expecting all of these great questions from reporters, like, what did you mean by that spicy comment? The lone question I got from our paper of record was whether or not I wore my glasses intentionally, or whether that was a theatrical move.
Wow. Okay. I was going to not comment on the potential sexism of a question like that, but I can't help myself. So, wow. I'd like to ask Mr. Dupree. So you ran not only as a challenger for your current position as district attorney in Wyandotte County, but you've run 2 elections, right? You ran as a challenger and you won, and since then you've run again as the incumbent. Can you tell us how the coverage you received? And here I want to be mindful, because obviously you've probably received a lot of coverage just by virtue of being the DA, but the coverage that you received sort of as a candidate in those 2 races, did you perceive a difference in that coverage?
Well, let me start by saying thank you for inviting me to the panel. It's indeed a pleasure and honor. I would say no, there wasn't a difference, but let me tell you why. And your study showed that there was only about 5% of the media coverage that was negative. I heard that and read that, and I was thinking, well, clearly I got the entire 5%, because because everything that I got was negative. Coming out of the gate, I'm coming from the background of former prosecutor turns public defender, turns private defense lawyer, decade as a private defense criminal, and then jumps out of nowhere to go against a 12-year incumbent who had been there for 35 years. How dare he? All of the coverage was, who is this guy? He needs to stay in his place. Go sit down, preacher man. I'm a Pentecostal preacher. So everyone was like, yeah, you're out of place. We can pray together, but you can't prosecute with us. And so that was, the coverage was literally anti-Dupree, anti my holistic prosecution thinking. And it was really more about, let's stay the course, stick with the establishment. And that was the first run. It's important to note that my county, I am the 3rd district attorney ever in this county. The first district attorney, once it was established in 1972, I believe, he was the DA for 32 years. And he is still the longest serving DA in the state of Kansas. And then when he retired in 2003, he high-fived his deputy, who was my predecessor, right? And so nobody had ever ran against a DA in this county. It was one of those things, you're tagged when it's your time, right? And so when this happened, it was a shock to everyone. And so all of the media coverage that I got was negative. It was anti my run, anti the thought that I should run. And then when I got in office, I changed some things. I fired a lot of people. And one of the deputies that was in the office under the previous administration, she then got suited and booted by all of the establishment that was anti-Dupree on the first run. And for the next 4 years, the Fraternal Order of Police, the unions, and all of the establishment geared up with her to hold on to that old school mindset to fight me for the next election. But it was a fight the entire 4 years. And so everything we did that we saw in the paper was to really push back against that old establishment. So I didn't see a difference because these folks were connected and rooted. I don't know how papers and media are in other places, but editorial boards are in bed with certain folks. My incumbent, he was endorsed by them for every time he ran. And so nobody was happy to see me get in there. So for me, it was no real change.
Okay, so that's fascinating. And I guess let me shift gears a little bit, because it's, I think we've talked a lot about coverage with respect to elections, and we did our study in an election year because we were very interested in that. But regardless of an election, like assume it's not an election year for a second, can you tell me a little bit now, since you've been in office, right? So you're the sitting prosecutor, about some of the challenges that you face when it comes to dealing with reporters? Like, what are the concerns that you have about how your office and your decision and the decisions that you make in that office get portrayed by reporters? And what, if anything, do you do to try to manage those concerns?
So I want to say this, and George, please hear me. I am a huge fan of reporters. I'm a huge fan of all forms of media. Now, having said that, it is very difficult, right? It's very difficult because the confidentiality is real and ethics are real. And here in Kansas, and of course, right, the American Bar Association says that there's certain things that I can't put out there concerning cases and concerning things that we're doing. And so when there's certain information that media wants that is covered by that 3.8 rule, then I can't give it to them. So then they create a story, right? And so that is very difficult because I can't push back on what I can't talk about. But I got to tell you, I did try at one point. I was like, no, they're not going to portray me like this. I got to let the people know. I got to tell them. And I had a press conference. Julie, you're right. I stood up there and I had a press conference and I started to tell them a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And I received 3 ethics complaints from the community, and they tried to take my license. Now, of course, it all went away. But the point is, even while trying to work with the media, there's a thin line that I have to be careful not to cross. And so, yes, I get some back coverage because I can't share certain stuff, but it's because I want to keep my license. So what did I do to kind of combat that? What I did when I first got in office, we did not have a public information officer in my office. Had never had one. One of the assistant district attorneys kind of served as a proxy liaison with the media. And the media said, look, your county has always been a black hole when it comes to cases. So we create our own stories. And so I hired someone who was a 30-year vet who worked for the paper, worked for the news, was in the military, traveling and doing this thing. And I brought him in and I told him to create an entire arena of this thing. And that's what he did. And he utilized his experience and his connections. And we built relationships with all of the media, even the ones that I know are going to twist my words, so that we can establish a bridge to communication and what those rules of engagement are. And then I created my own YouTube channel. I created a lot of community liaison boards and a lot of monthly deals that I put out so that I can have something to combat the mass media that's out there, so that I can talk locally to my people.
Did you want to add something, Mr. Joseph?
Yeah, I first of all, I wanted to say it sounds like you took a lot of like really positive resource building steps to help get information to various outlets, regardless of, the extent to which they're making a good faith effort to hear where you're coming from. I did want to make clear that I don't believe that every media outlet or every reporter is sort of acting in good faith and hearing both sides. And oftentimes this is colored by past relationships they've had. So if a previous administration they worked with for many years was in power, and then all of a sudden those people are fired and now they're, sharing their gripes, that can definitely happen and result in unfair coverage. So when I was focused on the economics of it, it was not to say that, unfair portrayals or coverage never happen. It's just to sort of help some shed light on the day-to-day pressures that drive some of these stories. I did want to give an example though of, a new administration coming in and, let's say you fire several, top deputies or something in the office. For a reporter, it may be very helpful in that kind of situation if, let's say, you fired them because of very particular policy disagreements they had, or because, let's say, they had a lot of appellate, findings of misconduct or something like that. That kind of context would be, extremely helpful in coverage of, that decision. So it's not sort of portrayed as coming out of nowhere, but for these very particular, reasons. So that's just one example, because I saw, both in San Francisco and Philadelphia, when the new DAs came in, there was this sort of narrative of like a purge and that kind of thing. But oftentimes they missed the politics of why those firings had happened, and just focused on the fact that they happened.
Yeah, Mr. Dupree, I wanted to ask you one more question before we open it up for the audience Q&A. And that was, I want to sort of set something on the table. I think I went into the study that we did with the assumption that if I want to find out what voters know before an election, I can figure that out by looking at the media coverage. But it occurred to me that that I imagine you speak with your constituents and people in your office communicate what your office is doing that isn't necessarily filtered through the media. I was wondering if A, you could confirm to me whether that's true, B, you can tell me whether that's done on purpose, but C, also give me a sense of, if it happens, how that communication happens and what sorts of things you might try to communicate directly rather than via reporters.
So yes, that is exactly what happens, and it happens on purpose, and it happens on purpose because I understand that different people have different perspectives, and the folks who are writing stories, who work for the paper or the news, they have their own perspective. Whether it's good faith or not, I agree with George. There are some who have straight out told me, we don't like you. And so I expect it, right? But so I know that that's coming, but even they have followers, right? Even they get the clickbait. And so I make it my business to when I first ran, I told everyone that I grew up here in my county my entire life, and I never knew who the district attorney was. Now, as a young Black man in America, that's great that I didn't know. But as a young college educated professional, that's not great, right? And so what I wanted to do was make sure that I exposed the young folks in my community. The context here is that Wyandotte County is the most ethnically and racially diverse community and county in the state of Kansas. So when you're talking about culture and race, and you're looking here in Wyandotte County, we are Kansas's diversity, right? And thus, I'm the first Black DA elected in the state of Kansas. And so I didn't know about this part of the government growing up. And so when I got here and when I ran, we focused on exposing the realities of what DAs do, what the criminal justice system is, and how you can be involved without being a criminal, right? That you can be the judge, you can be the lawyer, you can be the sheriff, so on and so forth. And so I came in with that. I rode the Metro bus during the campaign. I ride the Metro bus and have conversations with the folks who don't have transportation, because the law affects them too, right? And they want to talk to their DA. We created community liaison boards for the faith-based community, youth liaison board. We've created the young people's liaison board and on a quarterly basis, they meet directly with me. Our community liaison board, we have someone from each geographical location, whether you live in the suburban area or you live where I live, right? The other side of the track, and you didn't realize you was poor because everybody in the community was poor. We have those folks who are meeting with me on a quarterly basis as well, so that they can give me their perspective of what my job is concerning them. And then I can tell them directly what we're doing, what we're not doing. And it is my if you will, requirement for all of my employees, all of my assistant district attorneys. You have to be an ambassador. You will go into the community. You will go into the schools. And so we've done over 300-400 events with elementary, middle, high school, churches, nonprofit organizations, where we go to them and educate them on what we're doing, what things we're changing and why we're changing them. And so people have direct access to me and to my office, so that way when they hear something from whatever the television is saying, they listen. I've won 2 elections by quite a bit. They know what I'm doing versus what people are putting out.
That's very helpful. Thank you. So we have a number of questions from our audience that have come in while we've been speaking. So I was hoping we could get to a few of them in the sort of 15 or 20 minutes that we have left. The first question, I'm excited to say, comes from the newly elected district attorney here in Orange, Chatham County, North Carolina, Jeff Neiman. Mr. Neiman, I'm glad you're watching. And he asked something that I thought was really thoughtful. He was wondering how easy it is to disentangle the media coverage that an incumbent prosecutor receives as a candidate for re-election and the media coverage that a sitting prosecutor receives as a public official. And I have to confess, I don't know that our study is able to sort of clearly distinguish between those things. But I'd love to hear from our panelists about whether they think that distinction exists, and if so, how the distinction sort of is operationalized. So I'll hear from Mr. Knight and then Mr. Joseph, and then whoever else wants can also jump in.
Thank you. I just wanted to say we're simpatico, Mr. Neiman, because I had the exact same thought as we were going over the data. The results are fascinating, and I hope that you, Professor Hessig, or somebody else does take this and try to figure out a causal study that can come from it, because parsing those specific details out about how and why some of these disparities exist in coverage would be really, really helpful. Prosecutors need to be covered on a regular basis. Mr. Dupree needs to navigate all the difficulties of legal ethics and communicating to the public what his office is doing. But we also need to cover the politics and the policies during election cycles. And those things need to both be done effectively, but should probably be considered separately if we're trying to figure out how to solve biases in political media coverage during an election cycle specifically.
Great, thank you, Mr. Joseph.
I was just going to say, it's not just district attorneys in this case that use their office to promote their candidacy. Most elected officials, in my experience, do this, and it's a natural advantage they have because they can call a press conference around some policy, as Julie said, and immediately generate coverage because it's an easy thing for the media to coverage, especially if there is some substance there. I just wanted to share an example. A couple of years ago, the Westchester County District Attorney in New York was facing a pretty tough election challenge. And I filed a public records request to get the Giglio or Brady list of police officers that his county had compiled over the years who were found by judges to not be credible. Credit to his media person, they released that list to a friendly outlet instead of releasing it to me. And then subsequently, after that story came out, released the records to me. And so in doing so, they were able to sort of make it seem as if he was sort of unilaterally, deciding to be transparent for some reason, which was not the case. He ended up losing because of some other major Brady violations that we later wrote about. So I don't think it worked out for him in the end, but I just wanted to say it can be a very powerful tool.
That's fascinating. Did anyone else want to jump in here, or should we move to the next question? The next question that we have is really a question about, I guess it's sort of a question about causation, and it's a question about the extent to which coverage could prompt changes in policy. And there's sort of that broad question, and then I think a more specific sub-question which is the extent to which negative coverage or the fear of negative coverage might push a prosecutor to adopt more punitive policies. This is something that I think, has sort of been underneath the surface of some of the answers that we've gotten. But I'd be curious as experts, if you also perceive that it's not just that media coverage tells us what is happening, but that it can also affect what happens.
I'll jump in if you don't mind. I think yes and yes. I think that media coverage does in fact play a vital part in really showing what the policies are, really educating what those policies are, but they also do pretty well in showing flaws, right, in your policies that sometimes when you're actually in it, you may not see it. And so I think in that manner, those things that are shown that are flaws can be changed. Now, on the flip side of that, I'll tell you that there are a lot of traditional minded prosecutors who operate in that fear zone of, I don't want the bad publicity, quote unquote. So I'm going to do what they want me to do or what I think they want me to do so that I can either one, get good coverage, or two, win the election. And so I think that plays a huge part. Now, again, I think one of the benefits for me with all of the negative coverage, and let me say there's been some okay coverage. I've done a few things and some of them end up liking me. But with having kind of been thrown in the deep end of the pool with the negative and with the, kind of beat over my head type of reporting, I'm not scared, right? And so there's nothing out there that you can say about me. And when I say bad, I mean, folks, they came after my wife, they came after my children, my church where I pastor was degraded. I mean, it was all kinds of bad. And so for me, bad reporting or negative reporting or threatening me with a bad story per se, that doesn't scare me. And one of the things that I have to state, and I want to make sure I say this part, is that as a prosecutor, we have to be mindful, and Will kind of touched it. The politics of it is one thing, but then folks, you got a job to do, right? And you have to try to make the community safe. You have to make sure that innocent people are not being locked up on your time there. And you also have to listen to the voices of the victims, whether those are the victims who were just victimized or the ones who were victimized by a messed up system, right? But those things are very important that you do, and it has to be at the forefront, which means that sometimes the politics are second and thirdary, and you have to just kind of take it so that you can make sure you don't screw up your case or mess over a victim or somebody stays in jail when they didn't commit the crime.
All of that. And just to point out, the opposite can be true too. Fear of negative media coverage is the reason why, there are attorneys like me, blessed to walk the line between attorney and activist. And there have been opportunities where public pressure has led to charges being dropped. And I think that is equally as powerful. And the only way we get there is through excellent deep dive media coverage.
Great. I have a question that I think is really kind of fascinating, which is a question that gets at, how to have thoughtful but also searching media coverage of platforms for people who are running as non-incumbents. Because I think the person asking this question, I'm impressed. The stenographer sort of criticism could apply to simply repeating what a candidate for office who's not in office says that they will do or be able to accomplish. I guess I'd be interested to hear how to have sort of a balance of letting readers know what a platform is, while at the same time not simply presenting it without the context that I think Professor Thornburg and Mr. Joseph spoke about earlier, the context that readers might need to genuinely be informed.
I mean, I think you see a lot of in news coverage, especially of local races, and it has some pros and cons to it. You see a lot of like voter guides, right, where candidates can write what they want to write, and they don't face the inquiry from a reporter. And I think that a lot of times, there's an advantage of having those voter guides as a nice starting point, but then to face some inquiry from a reporter, not just that sort of can ask, are you wearing the glasses or not, but that can say, is that something you can actually do? Is that part of what a local DA's job is? And I think this is a real struggle that I see even with journalism education at the undergraduate level, that not enough of our students have basic civic awareness of what these key roles in their community do. And so if a DA says that I'm going to raise taxes, they're right. The DA said they're going to raise taxes, right? Because that's an accurate reporting of what the candidate said, with no context of what are the rules of the game and who are the key players. And so I think that there's a real challenge that news organizations that want to do coverage about civic life have to help fill a gap in our education of educating young people about what the rules of the game are, how they're played, so people can just have a basic understanding. And I think that candidates have to fill that gap and office holders have to fill that gap. Because there's certainly a gap that I'm seeing when my, when my students that aspire to be journalists are showing up and, they're not able to get to the craft of reporting because they don't have the contextual knowledge that they need or the subject area knowledge that they need in order to begin to pursue that.
And I suppose if I could just follow up, not to fall into the trap that everyone always does of thinking that whatever they do is particularly important, but does that maybe suggest that that crime reporting maybe shouldn't be a beat for folks who are just starting out, that it might, although, as Mr. Joseph mentioned, it's one of the 3 big beats. So folks need to, if it's going to get all the coverage, but I imagine, like I'm saying this out loud, but I imagine that there are plenty of other topics where context is also important. And so criminal law is special. Seems like a cop-out on my part.
Well, crime is an relatively easy job to give a young reporter because it doesn't require a lot of context. There's usually readily available information that comes from the police source, and it's episodic. But what it doesn't allow reporters to do is build those relationships over time. You end up in a transactional relationship with public office holders, and where if I were an office holder in one of those transactional relationships, I would say I'm just going to create my own owned media platforms. So that's an interesting idea. Are there places where we can put young people, like local high school sports reporting, stuff that is community building, where it is important to know the rules of the game and who the key players are and what the context is. Are there places that we can train young reporters, and can we break out of the advertising, attention-driven, daily beat reporting that crime lends itself to so easily? I think that's a really good insight.
So I think we have time for one more question, and I love this question. So someone picked up, Ms. Gunnigal, on your reference to the black box, and the question was, if you had to pick something that would get more media attention, and I suppose we could actually probably go around and everyone could say this sort of thing, but when it comes to prosecutors and the important job that they do, can you think of a topic or an action or a type of decision that needs to be made that should probably get more scrutiny than it currently receives? And everyone can have their own answer.
Can I go first? Because I have the right answer. It's plea agreements. Why are we not giving more attention to the fact that very few cases go to trial and our plea bargain / cash bail / charging system is inherently coercive?
I don't know if you know much about plea agreements, Professor Hessek, but I second that.
Mr. Will making fun of the book I wrote last year, I think.
I would say, not to take away from the plea bargain, I agree with that as well. But I would also say the innocence suffering. I think there's a lot of attention on victims, and I'm trying to be careful of how I say this, but there is this thought process that prosecutors are the voices of the victims, and that's it. And I have a huge issue with that, because as the DA, I'm the elected DA for the defendant. I'm the elected DA for the victim. I'm the elected DA for the families of both of those. And so you have a lot of people who are, I think, innocently caught up in this system, sometimes wrongfully, sometimes not, but are innocent there because of that. They're only listening to the victim's voice, and quite frankly, whoever is crying or get the attention the most from the media, and that leads prosecutors down the wrong path a lot of times.
Just to echo what Julie had brought up, I just think sentences, especially for more mid-level state prison sending offenses, deserve more attention. If you look at DA Eric Gonzalez, the number of prison years that he's accountable for relative to the violent crime rates he has is much less than other district attorneys across New York City. And that's because of the sentencing practices that his office has, which don't get that much attention, but just matter a lot in terms of the size of our prison population. So it's those sort of, as like John Pfaff at Fordham has argued, the sort of middle, decisions of 5 verse 3, 10 verse 8, et cetera, that, don't seem that major or newsworthy on a data level, but really do add up, that I think deserves more attention. And that has to do with the trial tax and plea bargaining. So that's why it's related, in my opinion.
Yeah. That's great. All right. Well, let me say that I think this has been a fantastic panel. I've been furiously scribbling notes down as everyone was speaking, because I think things have been said here that have helped change my thinking. Please, for the folks who are attended or who are watching this later on a recording, feel free to visit our website, the Prosecutors in Politics Project, to learn more about this and other research. And of course, if you'd like to support our work, we are a tax-exempt 501c3 organization, and it allows us to do more projects like this. So I hope you guys will all join me in thanking this amazing panel. Thank you all so much for your time. Enjoy the rest of your Wednesday, and I hope I get a chance to speak to you all again.